The wind, a razor, stripped the last vestiges of warmth from her. It screamed across the ochre flats, a land forgotten by rain and kindness, each gust a fresh torment. Her clothes, once sturdy, were now pathetic threads clinging to a frame starved of sustenance and hope. She had no name she dared speak, no past she could recall without a shudder, and no future she could envision beyond the next agonizing breath. The sun, a merciless eye in the bleached sky, beat down, and the ground, cracked and barren, offered no solace. Each step was an act of defiance against the inevitable, a whisper of survival in a world that wished her erased. She stumbled, a marionette with cut strings, her vision blurring the desolate horizon into a wavering line of despair. There was nothing out here. Nothing but dust and the echo of her own failing heart. Then, a flicker. So faint it might have been a cruel trick of the fading light, a phantom of a desperate mind. But it persisted, a pinprick of gold in the vast, indifferent canvas of the dying day. A light! It could be anything, anyone. Danger was as likely as deliverance in these wastes. But the alternative was certain demise, a surrender to the gnawing emptiness. So, she lurched towards it, a moth drawn to a distant, perilous flame, her body fueled by the last, sputtering embers of instinct. The journey was an eternity condensed into an hour, each yard gained a monumental victory. The light grew, resolving into the soft, square glow of a window in what looked like a low-slung ranch house, a solitary sentinel against the encroaching night. The wind still howled, but here, closer to the structure, it seemed to break, to lose some of its vicious edge. She reached a wooden porch, rough-hewn and sturdy, and her legs, finally, irrevocably, gave way. She collapsed, a heap of rags and bone, the hardwood a shocking, solid reality against her cheek. She thought she heard a sound from within, the scrape of a chair, a heavy footfall, but consciousness was a receding tide, pulling her under. Darkness, not entirely unwelcome, claimed her. Silas found her there when he went to check the generator. He'd heard no knock, only the usual symphony of the wind, a sound so familiar it was almost silence to him. The shape on his porch was unexpected, a disruption to the solitary rhythm of his existence. His first instinct, honed by years of isolation and a past he kept buried deep, was suspicion. He moved closer, his weathered face unreadable in the twilight, his hand resting near the worn hunting knife on his belt. It was a woman, or perhaps a girl, hard to tell beneath the grime and the tatters. Her breathing was shallow, a faint flutter against the vast silence of the plains. He saw the desperation etched into the lines around her eyes, even in unconsciousness, the raw chafe of ropes or restraints on her wrists, barely visible beneath the dirt. Something in her utter vulnerability disarmed his caution. He'd seen suffering before, had known it intimately. He knelt, his movements economical, practiced. He felt for a pulse. Weak, but there. He looked out at the endless expanse, then back at the fragile form at his feet. Leaving her out here was a death sentence. Bringing her in was a risk, a deviation from a carefully constructed solitude. The wind seemed to whisper a reminder of all he had lost, of the folly of connection. But another voice, deeper, quieter, the bedrock of his being, spoke of a fundamental decency he hadn't entirely managed to extinguish. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the wilderness itself, he gently, carefully, lifted her. She weighed almost nothing. He carried her inside, away from the ravenous wind, into the tentative warmth of his home. The door closed with a soft click, a small sound against the vast, uncaring night, shutting out the storm, and perhaps, for a moment, the world. He laid her on the worn rug before the hearth, the fire already laid but not yet lit. He would tend to that. He would tend to her. He didn't know why. Or perhaps he did, in a place deeper than words. He knew what it was to be hunted, to be alone, to have nothing left but the will to draw one more breath. And sometimes, that was all it took to find a reason to keep going. He fetched a basin of water and a clean cloth, his movements unhurried, methodical. This was just another task, another broken thing that needed mending on his isolated ranch. Or so he told himself, as the first flames began to lick the kindling in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on her still, pale face. She woke to warmth, a sensation so alien it was initially terrifying. Her eyes snapped open, wide with a primal fear, body tensing to flee. But the exhaustion was a leaden weight, pinning her down. She was on a soft surface, a rug, and the air smelled of wood smoke and something else, something clean and faintly medicinal. A fire danced in a stone hearth, casting a gentle, hypnotic light on rough wooden walls, a simple table, a single chair. Her gaze darted around the small room, cataloguing potential threats, escape routes. She was alone. Or so it seemed. Slowly, painstakingly, she pushed herself up into a sitting position. Her head swam. Her body ached with a profound weariness, but the biting cold was gone from her bones. Someone had covered her with a thick, woolen blanket, coarse but blessedly warm. Beside her, on the floor, was a bowl of water and a folded cloth, and next to it, a tin mug of what looked like broth, still steaming faintly. Her rescuer, whoever he was, remained unseen. She listened intently, straining to hear any sound beyond the crackle of the fire and the distant, muted howl of the wind, now a background hum rather than an immediate assault. There was a rhythmic thump, faint, from somewhere outside the main room, like an axe splitting wood, steady and unhurried. She remained frozen, a wild creature cornered, assessing. The broth was an offering. A test, perhaps. Or simple kindness. She didn't know which. Her throat was parched, her stomach a hollow ache. After what felt like an age, driven by a thirst that overrode her fear, she reached for the mug. Her hand trembled violently, sloshing some of the liquid over the side. She brought it to her lips, sipping cautiously. It was warm, savory, and the simple nourishment spread through her like a balm. She drank it all, then huddled back under the blanket, eyes still scanning, waiting. The thumping outside stopped. Footsteps approached the door, heavy, deliberate. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to become invisible. The door creaked open, and he entered. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his silhouette framed by the dim light from another room. His face was in shadow, but she could feel his gaze on her, steady, unthreatening, yet watchful. He carried an armful of firewood, which he deposited neatly beside the hearth. He didn't speak. He didn't approach her directly. He moved with a quiet economy, tending the fire, adding a log, his presence filling the small space without crowding it. She watched his hands, calloused and capable. They were hands that knew work, that could build and mend. They were not the hands that had hurt her. He straightened, and for a moment, their eyes met. His were the color of the winter sky, flecked with gray, and held a profound, weary sadness, but no malice she could detect. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, then retreated to the simple table, where he sat and began to mend a piece of leather tack, his attention seemingly absorbed by the task. The silence stretched, broken only by the fire and the whisper of his needle through leather. It was not an empty silence, but one freighted with unspoken questions, with a cautious awareness. He had offered her shelter, warmth, food. He asked nothing in return, not even her name. He simply was. And in his quiet presence, a tiny, fragile seed of something other than terror began to stir within her. It was too soon to call it trust, perhaps it was merely the abeyance of immediate fear. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't actively running. She was still. And for now, that was enough. Days bled into a quiet rhythm. He would leave food and water for her, then go about his chores on the ranch, the mending, the tending of a few hardy animals he kept in a sheltered corral, the endless battle against the encroaching wilderness. He never pressed her, never demanded speech or explanation. He offered her his space, his quiet protection, and left her to navigate her own terrors. Her nights were haunted by fractured images, cold metal, sterile lights, the devoid of emotion voices of her pursuers, the designation a Unit 734 echoing in the dark. She would wake with a silent scream lodged in her throat, drenched in sweat, the blanket clutched in her fist. Sometimes, in those moments, she would hear him stir in the other room, a cough, the creak of his bed, as if he sensed her distress even through the wall. He never came in. He simply let her know, by his continued presence, that she was not entirely alone in the dark. He left a change of clothes for her one morning, simple, mended things that must have once been his, a soft, worn shirt, a pair of sturdy denim trousers, patched but clean. They were too big, but they were whole, and wearing them felt like shedding a layer of her haunted past. She began to move about the small cabin when he was outside, exploring its confines. It was a sparse dwelling, utilitarian, but clean, orderly. There were few personal possessions, a small shelf of well-thumbed books, a faded photograph on the rough mantelpiece of a woman and a small child, their faces lost to time and sorrow. His sorrow. She understood that. Slowly, hesitantly, she started to contribute. One morning, he found the water basin emptied and wiped clean. Another day, the tin mug and bowl were washed and stacked neatly. Tiny gestures, unspoken thanks. He acknowledged them with that same quiet nod. He began to leave small tasks for her, if she chose to do them, the pile of vegetables for chopping, a torn piece of canvas that needed stitching. She found solace in the simple, repetitive work, a focus for her shattered mind. The silence between them remained, but it was less a void and more a shared space, a respite. One afternoon, as a dust storm raged outside, tinting the world a violent orange, he sat by the fire, carving a piece of wood. She watched him, her fear a dull ache now rather than a sharp terror. He was making a small bird, its wings unfurled as if in flight. His large, rough hands moved with surprising delicacy. He didn't look up, but he knew she was watching. When it was finished, smooth and perfect, he placed it on the mantel, beside the faded photograph. A small offering to a memory. Or perhaps, to a fragile present. Weeks turned into a month, then two. The harsh landscape outside began to show faint signs of a reluctant spring, tiny, tenacious flowers pushing through the cracked earth. A similar, tentative blooming was happening within Ilara, a name she had almost forgotten was hers. She still didn't speak, the words trapped behind a wall of trauma, but her eyes no longer held the constant hunted look. She would meet his gaze sometimes, for a fleeting moment. He had a routine of checking the perimeter fences of his small ranch each evening. One cool dusk, as he prepared to leave, she stood by the door, holding out his heavy coat. He stopped, surprised. He looked at her, then at the coat. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. He took it, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest instant. "Thank you," he said, his voice raspy from disuse, or perhaps emotion. It was the first time he had spoken more than a functional word to her. The sound of it, quiet, resonant, settled in the air between them. She simply nodded, her heart hammering. When he returned, hours later, cold and weary, she had stoked the fire and a pot of stew simmered on the hearth, filling the cabin with a rich, savory aroma. He paused in the doorway, taking in the scene. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his lips. He said nothing, but as he ate the stew, slowly, appreciatively, she felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the warmth of shared effort, of a silent understanding that was beginning to feel like home. One day, he was repairing a sagging section of the corral fence. He was struggling with a heavy post, the ground stubbornly resisting. Without a word, Ilara, who had been watching from the porch, walked over, picked up a heavy mallet, and with a surprising strength born of desperate resilience, began to help drive the post true. They worked together, a synchronized rhythm of effort, until the job was done. He wiped sweat from his brow, looking at her with a new appreciation. "Good work," he said. She looked down at her hands, dusty and sore, then up at him. And then, a small, hesitant sound escaped her lips. Silased his name. Her first word to him. It was quiet, barely a whisper, but it hung in the air, momentous. He stilled, his gaze fixed on her. A complex emotion washed over his face, surprise, relief, and something akin to profound gratitude. He nodded slowly. "Ilara," he replied, speaking her name as if it were a precious thing, a confirmation. She had found her name again, and in speaking his, had found a connection. The wall of silence had been breached, not by a flood of words, but by two names, spoken with a quiet reverence. It was a beginning. A fragile, precious beginning, coaxed from the barren soil of their shared solitude. The spring, tentative as it was in these harsh lands, deepened. With it, so did the quiet melody of their shared existence. Ilara's voice, once freed, remained soft, her words sparse, but they came more easily now. They spoke of practical things, the weather, the repairs needed on the ranch, the behavior of the skittish wild mustangs that sometimes grazed on the horizon. But beneath the surface of these mundane conversations, a deeper understanding flowed. She learned about Silas's life not through long confessions, but through shared moments. The way he would pause by the two weathered stones on a small rise overlooking the valley, his hat held in his hands, a silent communion with a past that was always with him. She never asked. He never explained. But she knew. She, too, carried her ghosts. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the wind a mournful song outside, she found herself tracing the patterns in the wood grain of the floor. "They called me Unit 734, she said, her voice barely audible above the crackle of the flames. Silas stopped whittling the piece of cartonwood in his hands. He didn't look at her, but his stillness was an invitation. "I was property. From a place far from here. A place where the sky is always grey." Her words were halting, fragmented, like pieces of a shattered mirror. "I ran. They don't like when property runs." He still didn't speak, but he reached out, his large, calloused hand covering hers where it rested on the rough floor. His touch was firm, grounding. It wasn't pity. It was solidarity. "You're Ilara," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "Here. You're Ilara." His words were a shield, a declaration. She looked at their joined hands, his strong and weathered, hers still bearing the faint, faded marks of her captivity. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. Not a tear of sorrow, but of a release so profound it felt like a physical unburdening. He was her sanctuary, this quiet man, this small cabin his fortress against the world. And in that moment, she knew she would defend it, and him, with the same ferocious tenacity she had used to survive. Their life settled into a rhythm of shared labor and quiet companionship. She helped him tend the small vegetable patch he coaxed from the unforgiving soil, her hands growing as capable as his. She learned to read the sky, to anticipate the sudden, violent storms that could sweep across the plains. He taught her how to track, how to find water, how to live in harmony with a land that was harsh but also possessed a stark, breathtaking beauty. He, in turn, found a measure of peace in her presence. The silence in his cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with her quiet movements, the soft hum of her occasional song, the unspoken assurance of another human being sharing his world. The faded photograph on the mantelpiece still held its place, a testament to a love lost, but it no longer seemed to cast such a long shadow. There was new life, new light, in the room. He found himself smiling more, a slow, unaccustomed stretching of muscles long dormant. He even laughed once, a rusty, surprising sound, when she'd comically stumbled trying to herd a particularly stubborn goat. The sound had startled them both, then settled into a shared, gentle amusement. It felt like healing. But the past, Ilara knew, was a persistent hunter. And even in this remote haven, she could never truly outrun its shadow. She just prayed it would not find them here, in this fragile piece they had painstakingly built, word by unspoken word, touch by gentle touch. One morning, the air was different. Still. Too still. The birds were silent. Silas, mending a harness on the porch, paused, his head lifting, his eyes scanning the vast, empty horizon. Ilara, hanging out freshly washed clothes on a line strung between two posts, felt a familiar cold dread prickle her skin. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice tight. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on a faint disturbance in the distance, a shimmer of heat haze that was just slightly wrong. "Trouble," he said, his voice flat, devoid of inflection, but carrying a weight that made her heart plummet. "Go inside, Ilara." "Stay down." She didn't argue. She knew that tone. She had heard it in her nightmares, the prelude to capture. She scrambled inside, her eyes darting to the old rifle Silas kept mounted above the door, a relic he rarely touched. He followed her in, his movements calm, deliberate, but a grim tension tightening the lines around his mouth and eyes. He took down the rifle, checked its load with an practiced efficiency that spoke of a past he didn't discuss. "They found me," she breathed, her voice a fragile thread. "How?" He shook his head. "Doesn't matter how. They're here." He peered through a small, grimy window. The shimmer had resolved into two figures on horseback, moving with an unnatural speed, their forms dark, indistinct against the glaring sun. Trackers. Even from this distance, she could feel their cold, impersonal intent. They weren't like the bandits or desperate scavengers that sometimes roamed these wastes. These were different. Purposeful. Relentless. The trackers reined in their unnervingly silent mounts 100 yards from the cabin, their faces obscured by dust goggles and wide-brimmed hats that seemed to absorb the light. One of them, taller, leaner, dismounted with a fluid, predatory grace. He carried no visible weapon, yet he radiated an aura of cold menace that chilled Ilara to the bone, even through the cabin walls. Silas stepped out onto the porch, the rifle held loosely, almost casually, at his side, but his stance was an unyielding line drawn in the dust. "This is private property," he called out, his voice steady, carrying clearly in the preternatural stillness. "State your business." The tracker didn't raise his voice, yet his words cut through the air like shards of ice. "We are here for Unit 734. Corporate asset." Fugitive. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze, invisible behind the goggles, seeming to pierce the very wood of the cabin, finding Ilara where she cowered. "We know she's in there. Send her out. No one else needs to be involved." Unit 734. The designation struck Ilara like a physical blow, stripping away the fragile identity she had begun to build. She felt herself shrink, the old terror rising like bile in her throat. But then she saw Silas. He hadn't flinched. He hadn't moved. He stood as solid as the ancient rock formations that dotted the plains. "There's no unit here," Silas stated, his voice hardening. "Only a woman named Ilara. And she's under my protection." The tracker let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Protection? Old man, you have no idea what you're dealing with. That a woman is a significant investment. We will retrieve her. One way or another." He took a step forward. The second tracker, still mounted, shifted, a subtle movement that suggested a weapon being readied. Silas raised the rifle slightly. "Another step, and you'll find out what I'm dealing with." The air crackled with tension, the silence so profound Ilara could hear the frantic thumping of her own heart. She saw Silas's knuckles, white as he gripped the rifle stock. He was ready to die for her, this quiet man who had asked for nothing, who had offered her everything. And in that instant, something within Ilara snapped. The fear was still there, a cold serpent coiling in her belly, but something else rose to meet it, a fierce, protective rage. Not just for herself, but for Silas, for this small, precious sanctuary they had built. She would not let them take it. She would not let them take him. She rose from her hiding place, her legs trembling but her resolve hardening into steel. She walked to the door, her hand reaching for the simple wooden latch. "No, Ilara, stay back!" Silas hissed, his eyes still locked on the trackers. But she ignored him. She stepped out onto the porch, blinking in the harsh sunlight, to stand beside him. She was small, still thin, her borrowed clothes hanging loosely on her frame, but she stood tall, her chin lifted. The lead tracker paused, his head swiveling towards her. A flicker of what might have been surprise, or perhaps just analytical assessment, crossed his hidden features. "Unit 734, he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "You will accompany us. Resistance is futile and will be met with appropriate measures." Ilara looked at him, at the cold, impersonal cruelty he represented, the cruelty that had defined her life for so long. And she found her voice, clear and strong, ringing out in the charged air. "My name," she declared, "is Ilara. And I am not your property. I am home." The tracker's posture stiffened. "Home," he echoed, a trace of something almost like contempt in his tone. "This desolate rock? With this relic?" He gestured dismissively at Silas and the cabin. You were bred for purpose, Unit 734. Not for sentiment. He took another step. Last chance. Come now. Silas's rifle came up, sighting down the barrel. She said no. His voice was granite. The mounted tracker urged his steed forward, a sleek, black pistol appearing in his hand, not a firearm of this world, but something more advanced, more sinister. Elara didn't flinch. She saw the small, carved bird on the mantelpiece in her mind's eye, its wings unfurled in flight. She saw Silas's quiet smile, felt the warmth of his hand covering hers. This was worth fighting for. This was worth everything. The mounted tracker fired, not at Silas, but at the ground near his feet, kicking up a spray of dust and superheated rock. A warning shot, delivered with chilling precision. The asset is to be recovered unharmed, the lead tracker stated, his voice still calm, almost bored, as if discussing livestock. You, however, are expendable, old man. He began to advance, his movements unnervingly smooth, his intentions clear. Silas stood his ground, but Elara saw the subtle shift in his stance, the calculation in his eyes. He was outnumbered, outgunned by their unfamiliar technology. But he wouldn't back down. Before Silas could fire, before the tracker could close the distance, Elara acted. In her hand, unnoticed until now, was the heavy iron skillet she'd been scrubbing when the stillness first fell. With a defiant cry that tore from her throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage and desperate love, she flung it. It spun through the air, a dark discus, aimed not with precision but with all the force of her reclaimed spirit. It caught the lead tracker on the side of his head with a sickening thud. He stumbled, his goggles flying off, revealing eyes that were startlingly, inhumanly vacant for a moment before they rolled back and he crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The mounted tracker, momentarily stunned by the sudden, unexpected ferocity of the asset, hesitated for a crucial second. That was all Silas needed. His rifle cracked, the sound sharp and definitive in the sudden silence. Not a killing shot, but one aimed with a rancher's skill, striking the advanced pistol from the tracker's hand, sending it spinning into the dust. The tracker cried out, clutching his numbed fingers, his face a mask of shock and pain. He looked from his disarmed hand to Silas, then to Elara, who now stood defensively in front of Silas, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing. He saw not a docile unit, but a wildcat. He saw the unyielding cowboy beside her. He saw the desolate, endless plains stretching out behind them, a land that swallowed secrets and intruders alike. The cost-benefit analysis in his cold, calculating mind must have shifted. This retrieval was becoming too complicated, too costly. With a snarl of frustration, he wheeled his mount, scooped up his fallen comrade with surprising ease, and without a backward glance, rode away, disappearing back into the shimmering heat haze from which they had emerged. Silence descended, vast and profound, broken only by Elara's ragged breathing and the distant, returning chirp of a brave bird. Silas slowly lowered his rifle, his gaze fixed on the spot where the trackers had vanished. He let out a long, shaky breath. He turned to Elara, his face etched with a mixture of disbelief, pride, and overwhelming relief. She was trembling, the adrenaline ebbing away, leaving her weak-kneed, but she stood her ground, her eyes searching his. He stepped towards her, his expression unreadable. He reached out, not for the rifle, but for her. He gently took her hand, the one that had thrown the skillet, and brought it to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. Elara, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You saved us. She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes, tears of relief this time. We saved each other, she whispered. He pulled her into an embrace, holding her tightly, his arms a circle of strength and safety around her. She buried her face in his worn shirt, inhaling the familiar scent of dust, leather, and him. It was the scent of home. He held her for a long moment, the silence between them no longer fraught with tension, but filled with a deep, unspoken understanding. The immediate danger had passed. They had faced her past, together, and they had won. He drew back slightly, his hands resting on her shoulders, his gaze searching hers, deep and earnest. The harsh sunlight softened the lines on his weathered face, revealing the profound tenderness beneath his stoic exterior. They might come back, she said, the fear a faint echo now. He nodded. They might. He paused, then his gaze firmed with a quiet, unshakable resolve. But this is our home now. Our land. We'll be ready. He looked around at the small, humble cabin, at the vast, empty plains that stretched to the horizon. It wasn't much, perhaps, by the standards of the world she had fled. But it was theirs. Elara, he began, his voice low, a little hesitant, yet filled with a conviction that resonated deep within her soul. He swallowed, as if the words were precious and difficult to form. This life, it's hard. It's quiet. Maybe not what anyone would choose. He looked directly into her eyes, his own shining with an emotion she had only dreamed of seeing. But if you would. He took a breath. Stay, he whispered, the word a plea, an offering, a promise. Stay with me, Elara. Forever. Her breath hitched. Tears streamed freely down her face now, washing away the last remnants of dust and despair. Forever. It was a word she hadn't dared to imagine. A word that, in this place, with this man, suddenly felt possible. Real. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat, a radiant smile breaking through her tears. Yes, she finally managed, her voice choked but clear. Yes, Silas. Forever. He smiled then, a wide, open smile that transformed his face, erasing years of sorrow and solitude. He pulled her close again, and they stood together on the porch of their small cabin, two solitary souls who had found not just sanctuary, but a family, in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness. The wind picked up again, but this time it didn't scream. It whispered, a gentle sigh across the plains, carrying the scent of distant rain and the promise of a new beginning. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and soft lavender, a masterpiece for two. They had no riches, no grand legacy, but they had each other. They had found their place. They were home. What does it truly mean to find a home? Is it a place, a person, or a feeling of belonging that transcends the material? Elara and Silas found theirs in the most unexpected of circumstances, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of quiet kindness. Their story reminds us that even in the harshest landscapes, both external and internal, hope can take root and flourish. If their journey from desperation to love resonated with you, please leave a like to show your support. We'd love to hear your thoughts on what home means to you, so share your reflections in the comments below. And if you want more stories that touch the heart and explore the depths of human connection, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching, and for being part of our community.